Okay, so let's get started. So we're happy to have Alex Teytelboym today, who is going to tell us about the Equilibrium Existence Duality. Equilibrium is Indivisibilities and income effects. So.
Thank you so much, Sigal Moshe, for inviting me to give this, and Ron, thanks for organizing. Delighted to be here. I saw the lineup. I think I'm the last one in the series, which is sort of amazing. I saw the people who were before me. I'm really honored. So thank you so much for having me. I apologize to Sigal and Moshe that this is not strictly speaking the topic of you that is in the title. There will be nothing algorithmic or game, but there will be theory. And as you see, it's going to be about existence of equilibrium. And this is joint work with my colleagues Elizabeth and Paul, and also with Ravi Jagadisan, who is a postdoc at Stanford, and Omar Edhan, who is at Manchester. So let me just launch straight into our motivation. We're thinking about markets with indivisible goods, and these markets matter because sometimes things are really quite indivisible, like in the case of housing markets. In particular, this assumption really matters when we're thinking about market design. So often in auctions, procurement auctions, or indeed just sort of quite well-known spectrum auctions, things are really quite indivisible. But what we know, and especially in sort of auctions with many bidders, people sometimes advocate for using competitive equilibrium as a sort of solution concept or as approximation of bidding behavior. But this existence of equilibrium is subtle. In particular, usually equilibrium doesn't exist in general. So there isn't a kind of a nice result that one might hope for, as you would in a convex economy world, as with Aaron de Breu. And what a lot of previous work has done is assumed that utility was transferable. In other words, that utility functions are quasi-linear for all agents, and this gave a lot of tractability to there's a long list of papers that have done this, this is fine. I mean, this is not a big deal. In fact, I think a lot of computer scientists write down a quasi-linear utility assumption without even giving it much thought as a perfectly reasonable approximation of behavior, especially if the market you're thinking about or the good in question is kind of quite small relative to your overall income. And so it's a perfectly good assumption a lot of the case. But in fact, if you think about settings in which we really care about indivisibilities, they tend to coincide with settings in which actually income effects or budget constraints of some kind are actually quite important, right? So if goods really need to be indivisible from a modeling point of view, it's actually quite likely that there will be income effects, that is, effects of how much money you have on your preferences. So with that in mind, we sort of want to give this setting a shot, basically, because it's not actually received a lot of attention, and it's because it's actually really hard to get anything working, as you will see. And so that's what we'll do. And the way we'll do it, and those of you who are economists in the room will have seen this in your. We'll go back to your first year economics, to this to consumer theory, actually. And what we'll do is we'll separate income and substitution effects, and I'll explain exactly what these things are later on. Okay. By the way, interrupt me at any point with questions and things like that. So what are we going to do? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to separate income and substitution effects by using what's called Hixian demand. So the way that we usually kind of, or if you like, maybe it's fair to say naturally you think about demand as you say, agents have endowments, they take prices as given, and they select their favorite bundle. With Hixian demand, what agents do is we fix utility levels rather than endowments. We then take prices as given, and agents pick their favorite bundle. Okay, so they're minimizing their expenditure given a particular utility level. And what basic economic theory tells you, and this actually also is true in the Indivisible Goods world, is that there is a duality between these two things. So a bundle is utility maximizing if and only if it is expenditure minimizing in the model that I will show you. Okay. So we'll do this, and what Hixian demand, this expenditure minimizing version of it, allows you to do is to separate income and substitution effects. And substitution effect is basically going to be the one where we think about the changes in prices for Hixian demand, so holding utility constant. And the income effect is going to be the effect on Marshallian demand of changing your money endowment, okay, how much money you have. And what we'll do is we'll take these Hixian demands. These are not things that you typically observe, but these, or really they're not kind of the natural demand, right? But we'll take these Hixian demand and we'll create what we will call Hixian economies, in which every agent is going to be selecting their bundle by this Hixian demand. And in these economies, utility levels will be held constant. So we'll completely turn off income effects. Okay, so there'll be no income effects. It'll be a transferable utility economy. And that's good because now we've said, well, we can go from Marshallian demand to Hixian demand, then we can go to a Hixian economy in which there are no income effects. So that's good. And we understand a lot of things about economies with income effects. And our key result is going to be what we call an equilibrium existence duality. And it says that equilibrium will exist in the original economy, the one we actually care about, if and only if it exists in each Hixian economy. So Hixian economies are going to be parameterized by these profiles of utility levels. So if equilibrium always exists in each Hixian economy, it will exist in the original economy. And that's going to be great because what it'll allow us to do is to basically move between the two economies and get new results for existence. Because we know a lot of things about transferable utility economies. We'll be able to basically describe what that means in the original economy. And this is going to give us completely new domains for existence of competitive equilibrium in the original economy when there might be income effects. But the key insight of going from the Marshallian world, the original world, to the Hixian world, this expenditure minimizing world, and the fact that you can go between these two, it actually tells you, combined with duality, that income effects, even though this paper is about income effects in and of themselves do not matter for existence. So I can take any weakest condition for which we get existence and describe it entirely in terms of substitution effects. So the bottom line is this paper is about income effects, but actually you can do everything without income effects that you might wish to do for existence of equilibrium. And so that's, I think, conceptually a kind of cool point. From an application, I'll give you a bunch of applications of how you can apply this stuff. From an application point of view, just get loads of new domains and you can get maximal domain results because you have this two sides of this theorem. Okay, is that all right? This is obviously a very quick, if this wasn't completely clear, obviously I'll explain all of this stuff in more detail, but that's basically the preview. The thing that is particularly exciting is the very last bullet point, which is the new domains bit. And they're easy to explain, these domains. They're not weird domains that you have to kind of jump over your head to try and explain. Okay, so this is basically, you're going to see a lot of picture that looks like this. And so what we're going to do is to do things like the following. We know that equilibrium exists in a transferable utility economy if agents regard goods as substitutes. So I think in an AGT seminar, one can basically assume everyone knows this fact. And so this is a transferable utility result. This is on the left-hand side of this picture. This is what we call by old. That is, essentially due to Kelso and Crawford. And because we have, on the bottom bit, we have this duality between preferences, we can then go immediately to asking, what does it mean for substitutability in a world in which there are income effects? So what is this appropriate interpretation? And what it's called net substitutability. It tells you that agents regard goods as substitutes when we look at their Hixian demand. That's what economists call net substitutability. And then by the equilibrium existence duality, that's the arrow on the top, it immediately tells you that equilibrium will exist in an economy with income effects if all of agents' preferences satisfy net substitutability. Okay, and as I will show you, not only does this give you a maximal domain, but it's also more general than gross substitute. Certainly more general than a transferable utility economy setting, but it's also more general than gross substitutability in a setting with income effects. So indeed, this is as as general as it can be for this setting. Okay, so I'll do a lot of that. So just kind of by way of preview, there's a huge literature on this. The papers that really matter are a bit less known, I think, outside of economics. So you've all heard of Kelso and Crawford, I'm sure. That was the paper that pointed out that there is a kind of fundamental relationship between tetonomon or deferred acceptance and existence of equilibrium in the setting with indivisible goods. And they're connected via this gross substitutes condition. Okay, so I'll come back to this point because it's going to be crucial for us. The example I will use quite a bit is going to be an example of a housing market, which was studied amazingly enough in 3 papers published in the same year in different journals by different authors, as these things sometimes happen. And the setting is very simple. Agents have preferences over bundles of a single house and money, and they're unrestricted. So you can experience income effects. Your preferences over houses might switch depending on how much money you have. And so you can only own 1 house at a time. This is not a kind of, British members of parliament are basically not included in this setting. So it's very much kind of, you know, the mere mortals single house. You can have no house, that's also fine, but you can't have 2 houses. We will analyze this setting. So all 3 of these papers gave a proof of existence of equilibrium in this setting, and I'll give you a 1-line proof using our equilibrium existence duality. And then in the paper you see online, we make a big deal out of this business of unimodularity. It's the sort of a domain of preferences that my colleagues Elizabeth and Paul worked on a lot. It's likely it's going to end up being in a separate paper, just because we ended up saying more things about it than we expected, and so I will not talk about it today. But actually, you can do a lot more. And this, in fact, this paper that I show you at the bottom is quite closely connected to what we're doing by Daniel Koshevo and Morota. It's an amazing paper. It's probably the most overlooked paper in this entire literature, and it's truly remarkable how much they've done. So we can give interpretations of some of their results and give kind of simpler proofs, essentially, of some of these things using our duality. But we can do much more. Okay. All right, so unless anybody has questions, I might as well just go straight into the model. Okay, all right, so the model is hopefully nothing too offensive. So we have set of I of indivisible goods. Everything's going to be finite, and there's going to be money. That's going to be the numeraire commodity. And there's going to be a finite set J of agents. So goods are I, agents are J. And for each agent, there's going to be some feasible consumption bundles of these indivisible goods. So you might regard some consumption bundles as being infeasible, right? So you don't want to mix, you know, espresso with, I don't know, you mix them with most things, with, I don't know, with orange juice. That doesn't sound very good, although both of these things are divisible, so maybe not the best example. But anyway, you can have infeasible bundles. And we will assume that there is a minimum level of consumption of the numeraire, of money. And we can set this to negative infinity, as I'll show you in the following example. So we have the following consumption. Your consumption bundle is going to be how much money you have, and the indivisible goods that you have. And you can have multiple units of indivisible goods if you wish. I will turn that assumption on and off as I need it, but in the general model, you can have multiple units of different goods. And as you can see, there's this sort of slightly pesky open bracket over here. And so what we're not going to allow agents to do is to actually hit that lower bound. Okay, so they're allowed to approach it as closely as they might wish to, but they're not going to be allowed to hit this minimum level of consumption of money. In other words, we're not allowing for hard budget constraints. So if this doesn't satisfy you, I can tell you that Ravi and I submitted a paper to EC, which deals with this point. And in fact, there is a version of equilibrium existence duality you can do without this assumption. Actually, existence of equilibrium becomes much kind of more subtle and even trickier once you have hard budget constraints and indivisibles in the same model. So here I will allow for, you know, soft budget constraints, financing constraints, these kinds of things, but not sort of hard budget constraints, which kind of give you non-existence right away. And I'll make some assumptions about the utility function. In particular, I will require that it's continuous and strictly increasing in money, and a few regularity conditions that you can see at the very bottom of the slide. So let me give you some examples of what the model covers, just so you get an idea of the sort of what it can, it cannot do. So one thing it can do is to cover the quasi-linear case that I'm sure you're all completely familiar with and used it in your own work. We can set the minimum level of consumption of numeraire to negative infinity, and then the utility function is simply given by money plus some valuation over the indivisible goods. Okay, so this is, and this valuation is just going to map any feasible consumption bundle to some real number. Yeah. So this is the standard formulation in a lot of mechanism design and much of the literature on equilibrium existence with indivisible goods. Now, we can do more than that. That's kind of the whole point of this, right? Else, why are we doing this? So, one thing we can do is, for example, to have a function like this, where your utility is the log of money, yeah, plus some function of the feasible consumption bundles, right? Some kind of valuation-esque or quasi-valuation sort of function, okay, which is going to assign a number to each feasible consumption bundle. And here you can basically imagine that you can set your minimum level of consumption of money to 0. And as you approach 0, obviously your utility will tank to negative infinity, and so this will actually satisfy our regularity conditions. Okay, so you're just not allowed to hit it, and log basically takes care of this. This is a lovely functional form to work with, by the way. We didn't realize this when we wrote it down. We sort of we fiddled around with it for a long time. It seems like if you want to make things separable in the way that they're written, essentially you're sort of you really pin yourself down to something that looks like this. But it turns out that geometrically it has beautiful properties, and we really didn't know this. Anyway, I'll show you some pictures in the end that use this log formulation. And geometrically, when you're thinking about sort of indifference in price space, they will look like beautiful straight lines. So that's really nice. So I'll show you this later on. All right. So we can capture income effects. We can do much more than just quasi-linear. All right. Any questions on the setup? Okay. All right. Well, stop me anytime. Okay. So let me just tell you about the different types of demand. So it might not be familiar to all of you, especially if you've not taken this sort of Econ 101, which is amazingly enough, this thing only gets covered in Econ 101. And, you know, many distinguished people working in economics never took Econ 101 because they just got a, PhD, and people skip this in about 20 minutes because it's such a kind of such a basic fact. But there are basically two types of demand that economists think about, and because they're economists, they label things after folks who invented them. So the first one is called Marshallian, after Alfred Marshall, and that's the one that you're going to be familiar with. It says that given a particular endowment and a price vector, you are selecting the bundle that is going to be maximizing your utility. Okay, so that's the one that is, completely standard, and you've probably used it in transferable utility contexts. The one that we're going to be interested in, and that's the one that's going to play the crucial role, and it's if I switch off my video, you will see an avatar of John Hicks, and that's called Hixian demand. And it says the following: given a utility level and a particular price vector, I want to pick the bundle that minimizes my expenditure. Right? It turns out, and this is what one learns in consumer theory, is a bundle of goods is expenditure minimizing even if it is utility maximizing. So this is a kind of duality result you might expect in this world, and it continues to hold in the transferable utility context. Mind you, you actually do need the assumption of no hard budget constraints, and we actually show this in our follow-up paper with Ravi, that this assumption, you can't just throw out the assumption of no hard budget constraints for free. So it comes at a cost, but you can still do cool stuff with them. So if you have quasi-linear preferences, these two things coincide. There are no income effects, and so there's nothing to worry about. And in fact, if I have no income effects, I'm just going to drop the little subscript M for Marshallian or H for Hixian. I'll just call it demand, okay? And so 99% of the papers one would read, I think especially in computer science, would basically just set things up in this way, and that's the perfectly natural thing to do. and people have analyzed income effects, but unless I think it's a specific paper about income effects, typically people make the assumption that is most convenient, and that's the one with quasi-linear preferences, in which we just talk about demand, and that doesn't get labeled by an inventor. Okay, so these things will coincide. Any questions? Fab. So here is kind of our main move. Okay, so this was kind of the insight that make this thing kind of work out, basically. The first thing we want to do is to think about the following object. We're going to define this object called the Hixian valuation. You see, now everything is going to be named after John Hicks, even though he never invented the Hixian valuation, but because it's related to Hixian demand, we're going to give him full credit. And we're going to invent this object called the Hixian valuation. It's not actually novel necessarily to us. It's appeared in other contexts. There's a paper by DeMonge and Gale in 1985 that came up with the same idea. But what we're interested in is, given a particular level of utility, and given a particular bundle that you already have, how much money do you need to get to that level of utility? Given that you've got this bundle. Okay, so you can just obtain this by inverting the utility function, and we need to stick a minus in front of it. And the reason why the minus needs to be there, it's because we need to convert expenditure minimization into, as you will see in a moment, into a maximization problem. Okay, so we'll need this little minus. And so Hixian valuation is a little bit like as you will see, it's going to play a role of an actual valuation. We're going to treat it as if it's a valuation in a quasi-linear setting, but just remember, it is not a valuation, right? It's very much this, it's a very different concept, right? It's really thinking about trying to measure how much money you need to get to a particular utility level, given you holding a particular consumption bundle, okay? And so here is a cool lemma, okay? It's in a way completely trivial and also completely useless if you are thinking about convex economies.
Alex,
oh yes, sorry, go on.
Quick question. So why doesn't xi appear on the left-hand side of this VJH? Like, this is a parameter of VJH, this xi?
Yeah, exactly. Because I can pick any, right? I'm thinking about fixing a utility level, and I'm thinking about I can vary the consumption bundle that I want, and then I want to get the utility level that I want to measure the amount of money that I need to get to that utility level.
So xi is this parameter, the dot parameter in this?
Yeah,
VJH?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I see.
So here is a cool lemma, which is honestly, it has no application outside of this that we could think of, and in a way, it's completely trivial, really. It just turns out to be exceptionally useful, and it says the following thing. It says that Hixian demand, this expenditure minimization problem, can be rewritten as a quasi-linear maximization problem, in which instead of having the valuation, we have the Hixian valuation. Okay, so now look, I've written Hixian demand as a maximization of a quasi-linear function. And what you'll see inside there is not valuation as you typically would if you were just trying to define demand, but for Hixian demand, we have this Hixian valuation. Okay, and that's great, because now suddenly we have Hixian demand. It's going to be very important, but we can basically treat it as some kind of quasi-linear maximization problem, and we know a lot of things about quasi-linear maximization problems for demand. Yeah. So what's kind of crucial, I think, conceptually here, and maybe this is not something that is the thing that you take away from this necessarily, but the thing that I think is interesting to, at least to us as kind of economists really looking at this and give an economic interpretation of this, it's that when you fix the utility level, the Hixian valuations basically capture substitution effects. That is how Hixian demand changes as you change prices. Yeah, and as you change the utility, what's happening is that the Hixian valuation moves around, and it's basically capturing the income effects. So the Hixian valuation basically embodies these two effects together, right? So as you change U, it's a bit like changing the money endowment. So what will happen is you will capture income effects. As you fix U and look at the change in prices, you capture substitution effects. As I'll show you, it's going to be the former that is going to play such a crucial role in what we're doing. Yeah. So with this lemma in mind, remember
Alex?
Hixian. Yeah, sorry, Yuval.
Sorry, just a small question to make sure that I follow. The demand is always negative?
Sorry, the demand is?
Hixian demand is negative, like the Hixian valuation is negative, right? And the price dots.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is it doesn't really matter, right? Because this is just a valuation. It can be anything. You can just renormalize things if you want. Yeah, because remember, I mean, the demand itself is going to be some bundle. So this is going to be some vector of positive numbers, right? Because there's some goods. But yeah, the valuation in principle is a negative. Honestly, it's just so we can convert maximization to minimization. You just kind of need to flip a sign. So it's nothing to worry about. But yes, you do have to end up dealing with a few negative numbers. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So just to again reiterate this, for a given utility level, this is a definition of our Hixian valuation. And then what I want to do is I want to say, okay, now I have my Hixian valuations. And I want to define a Hixian economy. Again, John Higgs did not invent this economy. We invented it and named it after him. We're going to give everybody a utility level. We're going to give Moshe a utility level, Sigal utility level, Aran a utility level, Marco utility level, Yuval utility level. And then I'll say, okay, go forth and expenditure minimize. Okay. And you can either do this just by picking the bundle that your Hixian demand tells you to pick, or you can just go and maximize the quasi-linear function that you saw on the previous page that also characterizes Hixian demand. Okay. So what's really nice about this Hixian economy is that by fixing the utility levels somewhere, we completely switch off income effects. So the changes in prices in the Hixian economy are only going to reflect substitution effects. It's a transferable utility economy. Why? Because all the agents are actually maximizing quasi-linear utility, quasi-linear functions. Yeah, but it has no income effects. And you know, you might ask, okay, how do these things actually work if you actually assume quasi-linearity from the start? The Hixian economy is basically equivalent to the original economy ordinarily. Okay. So this is going to be a key construction, and the reason why this is so useful is that we are going to do things in the Hixian economy that a lot of people have already done without calling it a Hixian economy. They just called it a transferable utility economy, and we'll apply this and we'll move back to the original economy. All right, so that's going to be the next move. So let me just show you kind of how to think about this, maybe with an example. So just taking back the example of a housing market. So the model with income effect says I have preferences over bundles of at most one house and money, and they're not restricted. Now, we have a very similar model to this, which is the assignment game, in which I can be assigned to a single good, and my utility is the value I place on this good minus the amount of money I've paid for this good. And this is, of course, due to Koopmans and Beckman. Yeah, that's kind of classic model. Now, what this Hixian world tells you is that basically what we've done is that you can move between these two economies completely, right? So the assignment game is really the Hixian economy of the original housing market economy. So I say switch off the income effects in the housing market. What I get is exactly the assignment game. Okay, and this comes from this quasi-linear interpretation of Hixian demand that I showed you before. Yeah, and then by combining all the agents, and that's a sort of a marvelous thing. Suddenly, you see the connection between these two models that actually, on the face of it, look quite different. And of course, proof of equilibrium existence in the assignment game is reasonably straightforward. Okay, maybe it wasn't straightforward in 1957, certainly straightforward now, but proof of existence of equilibrium in a housing market actually requires a topological fixed point argument. And so you might wonder, why is it that these two things kind of are so different if the models look the same? And so we'll give an insight on that as well. But actually, these two economies, if you like, they're dual to one another. Okay, one has income effects and the other one does not. Okay. I'll come back to the housing market again. So unless there's questions, I'll just kind of move on to the main result. So let me just sort of state formally what the solution concept is. So we're going to fix an endowment of goods. That's just going to be the goods that are available in the economy. We're going to say an endowment allocation. It's kind of like a feasible endowment allocation. is going to be an endowment for each agent that's going to come out of their feasible consumption bundles, XJ. And it better be the case that these endowments actually add up precisely to the total endowment. Yeah, so the goods need to be allocated among agents. Now, of course, you can imagine that once you have infeasibilities in the consumption bundles, you actually need to check that such an endowment allocation exists. So this qualifier is going to appear in a few places, but it's reasonably innocuous. So this is also completely standard. Given an endowment allocation, a competitive equilibrium is just going to be a price vector and bundles for each agent, such that market's clear and each agent picks their favorite Marshallian, their favorite bundle according to Marshallian demand. That is their utility maximizing bundle. That's what we're interested in, right? We're not fiddling around with the solution concept. The solution concept is the one that we're interested in. Is, of course, we're interested in Marshallian demand. That's the demand that we can observe. We can ask agents reasonably to say, tell me what is your utility maximizing bundle. We can't really ask them, fix a utility level and tell me which one is going to be utility minimizing, right? You can see Hixian demand is a kind of an abstract thing. Marshallian demand is a concrete thing that we elicit. So this is completely standard. And so, of course, with transferable utility, the endowment allocation does not matter, right? In a transferable utility setting, it doesn't matter who the goods are allocated to at the beginning. That's not what's going to drive existence of equilibrium. It's going to be conditions on agents' preferences that will do that, okay? Great, and so here is the main result. All right, so there's really just kind of one theorem in this paper. The rest are kind of applications of this theorem, and it says if an endowment allocation exists, and this is just kind of put a tick next to it, should hopefully be all good. Then competitive equilibrium exists in each Hixian economy for all utility levels, if and only if competitive equilibrium exists in the original economy for all endowment allocations, right? So we started out by the question of what's happening on the right-hand side, and as I will show you, we can use the left-hand side to tell us something about the right-hand side. So hence the equilibrium existence duality, right? We are interested in existence of equilibrium, all right? So as I said, just want to hammer this point maybe too much, that it's really substitution effects, because all you have in the Hixian economy is substitution effects. And so because of this result, it tells you straight away that all that matters for existence ultimately, right? And I'm being a bit vague about this, but really what matters for existence, in other words, give me any condition, any weakest condition on existence, I'll be able to write it down in terms of just substitution effects. So they really ultimately determine existence. And one direction of this is actually quite straightforward. It's quite easy to show that the direction of the arrow is easy. The hard bit is going in the opposite direction, showing if equilibrium exists in the Hixian economy for all utility levels, you do actually get the equilibrium in the original economy. So I'll quickly show you how the proof works. I think it's quite elegant, and so it might be worth seeing, and it will look a little bit familiar. So what is going on? So we are starting out in the Hixian economy, right? Remember, we fixed the utility level for everybody, yeah? And now what we want to do is to check what is agent's expenditure, right? So we've got the utility, and then we want to check what the expenditure is and compare it to their money endowment. And if we equate the two, we can fiddle with the utility levels. We can equate their endowment to their expenditure. We're done. We've got a competitive equilibrium, right? So the question is, can we solve for these utility levels? Okay, and that's essentially what we do. And so as you're adjusting these things, this is a kind of a fixed point argument. It's like it's an auctioneer, right? It's an economists call it sometimes the Walrasian auctioneer. That's how we refer to sometimes to the Kakutani's fixed point theorem. There is a guy calling out prices is the usual way. Here, there's a guy calling out utility levels, yeah? And what's going on is that we are going to want to try to balance the agent's budget. So if the utility level is too low, that means that the agent is overspending, and we are sorry, if the utility level is too high, then the agent is overspending, right? It's too happy, he's overspending. That's not good. We're going to want to lower his utility a little bit. If the utility is high, then the agent is, if the utility is very low, we will need to raise it because the agent is underspending. The agent is very unhappy. And there are kind of technical things one needs to do here. One is, do you actually have existence and of equilibrium? So the hard thing is basically to make sure that the set of equilibrium payoff levels in the Hixian economy is actually compact on convex. Okay, so that's the thing that requires the most work. So you need to take this economy, which is at the beginning unbounded, and bound it in a way. And we're using a trick that we've used in a previous papers of ours. And the proof of these statements, the compactness, the convexity, and the upper hemicontinuity of this correspondence does actually rely on the transferable utility nature of it. So we really don't know how to do this without there being transferable utility. So in particular, let me give you an example. Suppose that in this economy, in the Hixian economy, we had some small taxes, distortionary taxes. Everything would be quasi-linear, right? But there were taxes. Our proof would not work. So you would need to do something else. The duality might still be true, but our proof certainly wouldn't work. So we're really using the transferable utility assumption. That is, every agent's preferences are really truly quasi-linear, and there is no other business. You can really move utility costlessly between agents. And with that, you just, once you've got compactness and convexity, you just apply Kakutani's fixed point theorem. You have a fixed point, and that fixed point is actually going to be the one that tells you that expenditure and money endowments are going to equate for all agents, and that's your original equilibrium, okay, in the original economy. So in a way, it's actually quite the method is very similar, right, to the one you would use to prove existence of equilibrium in, say, a convex economy, right, where we would use a Kakutani's fixed point theorem and this sort of auctioneer argument on prices, right? And people have applied this to, say, welfare weights and stuff, but we've never seen anybody apply it to utility levels. And in this context, it seems that what you need to do is to apply to utility levels, which is quite cool. And you might be interested in the technical stuff, but maybe that shouldn't be the focus, given how much time I have. Are there any questions about this? Okay.
It's not a question per se, but I guess there will be examples later on, because right now it's a bit high level. And
yeah, absolutely. I'll give you something super concrete now. I obviously need to show you the main result, but you know, this is kind of the hammer which we are going to knock every nail in. Okay, so this is very important, and I think it's also important to emphasize that, you know, a topological fixed point argument appears here, and so we should now be surprised why it might appear in, say, the housing market economy, right? So, and the fact that we now suddenly need a non-constructive argument for existence tells you that maybe things are not going to be as pretty in economies with income effects. And that's also a point I'm going to come back to. Yeah.
Using strict monotonicity, because like housing market is not strictly monotone in the sense that I'm like saturated when I get one house, right?
No, so we only use strict, no. So you don't have to, no. So only strict monotonicity in money. So I think that's an assumption they also maintain in their papers.
I see, it's only in money.
In money, yeah. You're absolutely saturated with one house, unless you're a member of parliament in Britain. Good. So let me show you how to apply this, right? So now let's just go back to the housing market. So we already showed you that the assignment game is dual to the housing market, right? One has income effect and the other one is just got income effect switched off. That's the assignment game. And we already know, because of Koopmans and Beckman, this is the left-hand side of the picture, that equilibrium exists in this transferable utility economy. And so by the equilibrium existence duality, that's the one-line proof. Equilibrium exists in the housing market. So Quinsey, Gale, and Svensson gave these deep and very different proofs, all topological arguments, but very different proofs, multiple pages long, to in their specific context, kind of showing why equilibrium exists. Here you can do this in one line, having proved the equilibrium existence duality, which of course does take 10 pages or so. But you know, once you've paid the fixed cost, you can then do this in one line. Okay, so that's the example that we've seen. I want to obviously apply it to things that are going to be a bit more exciting, hopefully. I think that's what Yuval was getting at. Can you show me an example that I can take away and tell everybody about? So this is the one that I'd like you to take to the pub with you, or whatever version of, whatever one calls a pub in Israel, but you know, a bar, I suppose. Okay. Any questions at this point? Because I'm going to kind of go through this application, and it's also going to have kind of a lot of stuff going on in there. Okay, fabulous. So I'm going to talk about substitutes, and we care about substitutes in part. You know, it's all Kelso and Crawford's fault. They identified this as an amazing domain of preferences under which you can, not only does equilibrium exist in an essentially transferable utility economy, but also it allows you to construct the equilibrium by running the Gale-Shapley algorithm, right? And I'm sure many of you, perhaps all of you, have basically seen this construction at one point. But it works like an ascending auction. So just run an ascending auction is the argument of Kelso and Crawford, and increase prices of over-demanded goods, and because of substitutability, demand will switch to other goods. And once you clear over demand for every good, you will get yourself to an equilibrium. And it's a kind of, yeah, it's such an amazing and fundamental thing, connected price theory to matching markets, to markets with indivisibles. It's, yeah, amazing. So we're going to basically revisit this. And so I'm going to assume, to keep things very simple, you don't need to, that there is at most one unit of each good. Okay. You can do this without, but the definitions will become a bit more cumbersome. Okay, so let me just give you a definition of what substitutable means formally, okay? And now I want to use Kelso and Crawford's language for this, okay? They called it gross substitutability, right? Gross refers to things that happen for Marshallian demand. Net are things that happen to Hixian demand, okay? That's the standard thing that economists use. So they call their condition gross substitutability. In a way, it was a strange thing because they had a transferable utility setting. So you didn't really need to specify that it was gross. And there's actually a footnote in Kelso and Crawford that says, yes, well, we could have just dropped gross, but we wanted to keep it to like really show that it looks like it's really about Marshallian demand. And I think that's a lovely thing. So here's a definition. A utility function more generally is gross substitutable at a particular endowment if you increase the price of one good, right? And that's going to be, here it's going to be, I'm going to increase the price of good I, yeah, by some amount. And I start out in a place where demand is single valued, and I move to another place where demand is single valued, yeah? So cross from one place to another place by increasing the price of one good. Then it must be the case that the demand for all the other goods has weakly increased. That's what it means to be substitutable, yeah? So if the price of a yellow Lamborghini goes up, it better be the case that your demand for red Lamborghinis weekly goes up, because they're kind of substitutable, yeah? Unless you collect Lamborghinis and you really need the last color, in which case they're definitely complementary, but you get the idea. So if you have a transferable utility setting, there is no distinction between gross and net, right? There are no income effects. And so the reason why there is a distinction is the presence of income effects. And so we can just call this condition substitutability. And indeed, I encourage you all, whenever you write papers, and I know some people in the audience have written papers using the phrase gross substitutability, I encourage you to revisit them and strike out the word gross if you've been assuming quasi-linear preferences, because what you really meant is substitutability. But there's a reason, right? The gross thing is going to be important. When I'm going to come back to how we would run an auction, the word gross does conceptually kind of make sense, okay? So what Kelso and Crawford showed in a transferable utility setting, that equilibrium exists with substitutes. Now, what is net substitutability? It's exactly the same definition. I've replaced one, I've replaced maybe just like three letters here, right? So now for all utility levels, right, rather than endowments, utility levels, prices and lambda, if Hixian demand, note sub H, yeah, starts out somewhere single valued, we increase the price of one good, we move somewhere else single valued, it better be the case that the Hixian demand for all the other goods weekly goes up. Yeah, so it's kind of analogous definition. And of course, if you start out with substitutability in the transferable utility setting, by using our quasi-linear interpretation of Hixian demand, it just tells you that you can just move between net substitutability and substitutability, right? I mean, you know, they're kind of identical up to using valuations versus Hixian valuations, right? It's the same definition. And as I said, we already have equilibrium existence under transferable utility due to Kelso and Crawford, that's the left-hand side of the picture. I'm now going to apply equilibrium existence duality to the top part of this picture. And this gives me a completely brand new result that equilibrium in fact exists in economies with income effects if agents' preferences are net substitutable, or the utility functions, I should say, are net substitutable, okay? And so that's the theorem on the bottom. Really, it's a corollary really of the duality. We call it a theorem because we think it's really important, because substitutes are such a famous and important domain. Under net substitutability, equilibrium exists for all endowment allocations, okay? So that's a new result. Strictly speaking, this is not a new result. I should be honest about it. It appeared very kind of tangentially in Danilov, Teytelboym, Morota, but they didn't understand that what they were dealing with was net substitutability. And so we're very upfront about this. But we think we've given it a very clear interpretation. And in fact, you can go much further as we do with our tool. But we should give credit to Danilov, Teytelboym, Morota. It's an incredible paper. They really had this result in their paper. So here is why we can do more in particular. One thing we can show is, in fact, you might ask, wait, but is net substitutability actually more general than gross substitutability, right? Well, certainly for the case of transferable utility, right? That's straightforward. The question is, in a setting with income effects, is it true that net substitutability is more general than gross substitutability? And the proposition you see on the top tells you that, yes, this is in fact the case. And this is an important thing to do, just to make sure that we've actually stretched the domain for which we know existence happens. This proposition actually tells you this is the case. If there's an endowment of goods for which the utility function is gross substitutable, then indeed the utility function is also net substitutable. The converse is absolutely not true, right? So let's think back to the housing example, okay? So we have one agent. Okay, we just think about one agent's preferences. Let's call her Martine, Martine Quincy. And so she owns a house, and she's considering selling her house and buying either a luxurious house or a Spartan house. Okay, kind of a downsizing to a kind of a condo. Okay, and now what's going on is that she would only buy the very luxurious house if she's got enough money left over, right? So if the price of her house goes up, this makes Martine stop demanding the Spartan house. Okay, so the price of her house goes up and she stops demanding another good. Now this violates gross substitutability by definition, right? Straight away. Why does this happen? It's because she's experiencing an income effect, right? The reason why she has switched her demand from one house to the other is because now she's richer. She thinks, I don't need to live in this Spartan house. I'm sitting on a lot of wealth. And I'm going to go and buy this more luxurious house. Okay, this violates gross substitutability. So you're going to go straight away. You can brush off, right? Even in very simple settings, you do not get this. But of course, her preferences absolutely satisfy net substitutability. Okay, and if you want a kind of intuitive reason for why this happens, kind of maybe technically, is that what gross substitutability does, it constrains two things. It constrains income effects and it constrains substitution effects. Whereas net substitutability does not say anything about income effects. It only constrains substitution effects. And so that's why it's more general, right? There was no constraint on income effects, but actually gross substitutability places very strong conditions on income effects. In fact, when we worked with gross substitutability in a setting with income effects, we didn't realize actually how bad this was until our paper had already been accepted. And we had to sort of, anyway, I can tell you about this offline. Good. So let me tell you what more we can do with the equilibrium existence duality. One of the reasons why it's nice to have the duality going in both directions, we can use the only if direction to prove maximal domain results. Maximal domain meaning what? Meaning that if one agent's preferences do not satisfy some condition, I should be able to cook up preferences such that no equilibrium exists. And in a transferable utility setting, it is well known that substitutability does actually define a maximal domain. This was first proved by Goul and Stiketty and extended to kind of various settings by other people. And so what we can do is to basically give you the same result using the only if direction of our theorem. And it says that, you know, analogously, if you've just got two agents actually, if one agent's preferences are not net substitutable, I can find you substitutable valuations, right? So they can even be the rest of my agents in my constructed example only need to be quasi-linear agents with quasi-linear preferences. So against substitutable valuations for other agents and an endowment allocation such that no equilibrium will exist. So indeed, you get the maximal domain. So in other words, net substitutability is the most general way to incorporate income effects into substitutability and continue to guarantee existence. Okay, so hopefully that's the reason why you actually want to go in both directions. With the duality, you can use the if result for some result and the only if result to get you maximal domain, and we give other maximal domain results in the paper that you see. So hopefully this is most to Yuval's concern. Can you give us an actual example of what this is going on? This is maybe still too abstract. You know, I was hoping maybe substitutes is a bit more concrete. Let me pause actually before I do this and ask people questions about substitutability specifically, and then I can explain this example, which will connect it also to auctions. Everyone happy, or perhaps everyone unhappy, but thank you for sticking it out. So here's an example of, you know, why net substitutability is really different from gross substitutability. And I've already told you that net substitutability is the most general condition. It does not constrain income effects, but it still guarantees existence. But what I want to revisit is this amazing connection between equilibrium existence and ascending auctions, right? That was identified with substitutes by Kelso and Crawford, okay? So what we've done here is to cook up a really simple example to make this point really vividly. So there's two buyers, if you like, right? So there's kind of guys who want to buy goods and they've got $10 each and they have the utility function that you see on the screen, okay? And as I told you, if you use logs, so if you make the F function also a log, you're going to get a very nice picture. So I'm using log money minus log of the goods, yeah. And then there's a seller. This is the guy that actually owns both goods, but he puts no value on them. Okay. So we can think about it as kind of as an auction setting almost, right? There's a seller and there's two buyers. Yeah. And so let me just take you through what's going on in here. What I've done on this picture, this is price space. Yeah. So there's price of good 1 on the x-axis, price of good 2 on the y-axis. And you might have seen pictures that look a bit like this in Kelso and Crawford, if you've ever read Kelso and Crawford. But there's pictures like this floating around if you want to think about geometric interpretations of these conditions. What I've done here is that in price space, I've identified regions where demand is single valued for the buyers. Yeah, they have identical preferences. So when prices are very low, that's the bottom left corner, yeah, of this diagram. Prices are very low, they want both goods. When prices are very high, that's the top right part of the picture. They don't want any goods, they want nothing. And when the price of good 1 is very low, but the price of good 2 is very high because they have substitutes preferences, they demand good 1. And if the price of good 1 is very high and the demand of good 2 is very low, they just demand good 2. That's the bottom right. Yeah. So and these red lines that you see that carve up the space, my colleagues have called them loci of indifference prices. That is, these are prices where agents is indifferent between one bundle and another bundle. So on these red lines, they will demand, depending where they are, they're going to demand both bundles. Okay, and it turns out the geometry of these things is really important to existence of equilibrium. And my co-authors Elizabeth and Paul wrote a beautiful paper about this. So this is what they look like in this example. And so this is what I wanted to emphasize maybe very quickly. So if you have log-log preferences of this kind, these red lines are straight lines, which is pretty cool. Because in general, they can be wobbly and squiggly and do all sorts of nasty things, right? But it turns out with log-log, they're lovely and straight lines, okay? So that makes them very easy to draw. Once you can draw these pictures, you can cook up all sorts of great counterexamples and things like that. So you might have to take it on trust that this is actually a two-scale drawing of the preferences of the agents, okay? And so this picture actually perfectly represents what's the preferences of the buyers. And I can tell you something else. There is, in fact, a unique competitive equilibrium price vector. Okay, and it's the one that is given by price 6 for good 1 and price 3 for good 2. So, I mean, equilibrium, it not only exists because preferences are net substitutable, but the equilibrium price vector is also unique. I mean, how hard can it be to find equilibrium in that world, right? And so you might think, okay, well, let's run the Kelso-Crawford argument. We're going to start out at very low prices, and we're going to increase them when the goods are over demanded, right? So we're going to start out at 0, 0. Yeah, agents are going to report back their demands. That's going to be 1, 2. Both goods are over demanded because they're both saying 1, 2. So we're going to increase prices, and they're going to increase along this 45-degree line that is shown to you in blue. And the first bit of action that's going to happen to the auctioneer is when the prices hit the red line, which happens, I don't remember, something like at 4 2/7 or something like that. Okay, so that's where you get to, and at this point, agents say we're actually indifferent between 1, 2, and 1. But you have already messed up because you've remember the Kelso-Crawford construction is an ascending auction, but you've already shot past the equilibrium. So you can already see right now that you are now no longer, you will have to decrease the price of good 2 in order to get back to the equilibrium. So you've already messed up. So clearly the Kelso-Crawford construction does not work, even in this very simple example. So why does this happen? It happens because the utility of the buyers is not gross substitutable, right? So we're in price space here. And so think about what happens when the price goes from somewhere like 4, that's quite close to the end of the blue line, to 5, 4. What you're doing is you're going left to right, and you're crossing the red line that is touching the blue line. Yeah, that's what's happening. That's kind of roughly where we are. And what's going on is, note, you're increasing the price of good 1, but the demand for good 2 falls because you've moved from a space where you demand goods 1 and 2 to only where you demand good 1. So what you've got over here is actually a violation of gross substitutability. That's exactly why the Kelso-Crawford argument geometrically doesn't work. It's because when you have red lines sloping in the way that this part does, what it's indicating is actually a complementarity. Yeah. And so you can get this in this world. And yet, despite the presence of these apparent complementarities, you still get equilibrium existence. But crucially, we have decoupled equilibrium existence from Teytelboym. And so what's kind of been slightly mind-blowing to us is that in every context where we had encountered substitutes and we wanted to prove existence of stable outcomes or competitive equilibrium or all sorts of nice things like that, or if we were Paul Milgram and we wanted to run the SMRA, right, which is really a kind of Kelso-Crawford argument, there was this crucial connection between equilibrium existence and the construction of this equilibrium via finding, I should say, of this equilibrium via the ascending auction, right? One always gave the other. Gauss-Shapley gave you stable outcomes, ascending auctions gave you competitive equilibrium, and we all know that these things are kind of intimately connected. Here, this does not work. This absolutely does not work. You have a very simple equilibrium existence problem. There was only one equilibrium price vector, and yet the ascending auctions shoots well past it, and you fail to construct it. And again, you might think, kind of on a very high level, why does it happen? Well, it's kind of not surprising that we've needed to use a topological argument in the proof of equilibrium existence duality. And so this is sort of reflected in here, right? This is kind of one of these instances where, construction doesn't work straightforwardly. You really need to know existence. You really need to know something more than just this kind of a nice construction path. Okay, so I think I'm bang on time. So I'm very pleased. It's exactly half past according to my clock. So here is the last slide. You can just sort of read it, but I'll just remind you what we've done. We've used duality from standard consumer theory to separate income and substitute effects. And we came up with this sort of slightly more intuitive way of writing down Hixian demand, which made it look like it's just an agent maximizing quasi-linear preferences. And we've just used this idea to move between economies with and without income effects, in addition to this, we've then bolted on the equilibrium existence duality that allows you to move between equilibrium in one economy and equilibrium in the other economy. What this told us is that, in fact, substitution effects ultimately, that is how your choice of expenditure minimizing bundles changes, fixing a utility level as prices change. That's what determines equilibrium existence with indivisible goods, not kind of income effects per se, right? They don't really matter for existence. But what income effects really matter for, going back to the previous example, is finding equilibrium. If income effects are present, you might shoot past your equilibrium if you run an ascending auction. Why? Because net substitutability allows for the presence of gross complementarities, right? Because it violates gross substitutability. It allows for the presence of gross complementarities. And the ascending auction argument for existence does not work if you have gross complementarities, okay? But what it does sort of indicate is a bunch of cool stuff. So one thing we've done is to apply it to matching markets, because everyone who has ever thought about competitive equilibrium with indivisible goods eventually started thinking about matching markets and stability in them. And so Ravi and I submitted a paper on that. In that context, we're thinking about stability in a two-sided matching market. And what's kind of cool, actually, we allow for hard budget constraints. So that's one of the things that is definitely new. But one of the things that is quite cool is we can get stable outcomes without getting competitive equilibrium outcomes. So we can get stability without competitive equilibrium. So competitive equilibrium doesn't exist because of the hard budget constraint, but it turns out that actually you can still get stable outcomes, which is, I think, pretty cool. And the kind of net substitutes make an appearance there as well. If you're interested about market design, what this tells you is that you should be a bit careful about using ascending auctions, right? If you want to get to an exact competitive equilibrium, because there's going to be gross complements. And I think people are sort of aware of this in principle. The thing that it does sort of raise is, should we be thinking about auction designs and languages, auction languages, in settings with income effects where we know equilibrium is guaranteed? So my co-author Paul Klemperer has thought about very clever sealed bid auctions for the transferable utility setting with substitutes called the product mix auction. So something like this, and Paul Milgram has done similar work, sealed bid auctions that basically elicit substitutes preferences. You can think about sealed bid auctions that elicit net substitutes preferences of some sort, and then running those. And of course, as I promised to Moshe and Sigal before we started, I have an actual open question for computer scientists here in the audience, which is about algorithms to find equilibria. Our sort of cheeky conjecture is finding an equilibrium in general is PPAT complete, but when we say these things, we don't really understand what we're saying because we're sort of just riffing off what we've understood happens for Nash equilibrium. So the kind of my understanding of these things is if Kakutani fixed point theorem makes an appearance, then you're probably in that world. And so that's kind of our conjecture. Now, maybe that's only true in the general setting. Maybe with net substitutes, things are different. But I'm not an expert on these things, so I will certainly not tackle this question on my own. But if people are interested in this, I think that's a pretty cool thing to settle. Maybe you'll get the obvious answer, but maybe not. And especially if you're thinking about restricted worlds, maybe the housing market setting or the net substitute setting more generally, maybe you get a different complexity class. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry to run over time, but that was only because of the last slide, and hopefully that 4 minutes was not too badly spent.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so since we're over time, if you need to leave, feel free to do so. I just want to stress that we still have many gay talks planned for this semester. This is not a last talk. And if there are any questions, then this would be a good time.